the infamous Miss Adams. A lot of you will be using her chemistry videos. The number of times I've heard, I've got to thank this Miss Adams, whoever she is. So now we're going to see the famous Miss Adams. Do you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Wendy Adams. I'm Miss Adams Chemistry. I'm the PT of Science at Ross High, and I'm really excited to be here to chat about questioning today.
Good, right. Thanks a lot, Wendy. On to the learning outcomes.
Douglas, just before we start, sorry, just to jump in, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. So this session is going to be recorded. The reason that we're recording this session is for teachers that couldn't be here today, that we can share. It'll only be shared with the teachers that have registered. If there is any issues with the recording, feel free to email me afterwards, or if you want, just switch off your camera and they won't be able to see you. So I had to make that there.
Hey, thanks a lot, Stephen. I think most folk know that this is the second of 3 workshops really designed to test the hypothesis that there is a demand for Scottish-specific chemistry CPD designed by teachers of Scotland, for teachers of Scotland. We're very interested in your feedback. Use the chat whenever you want, and we'll try and monitor what's being written on chat. The workshops, as I think Stephen said, organised in partnership between Edinburgh Napier University and the Royal Society of Chemistry. The learning outcomes for today are in the form of questions. Paul, you like to use questions for the learning outcomes, is that correct?
I do indeed, yeah. It's actually something I picked up from yourself. I like the fact that what you can do, it makes plenaries quite nice at the end of lessons, because you can then say, okay, well, for the plenary today, answer the question. Or if you're writing a scientific report, which is quite common, obviously for us, then your conclusion just becomes answer the aim, answer the question that you started with. I think it just works really well for me as a way to do things, and sort of builds a nice structure to lessons.
Well, that's something that those that haven't tried to use questions can perhaps try and put into practice. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Colin?
Yeah, so up at this slide, I'm just going to try and set the scene about why questioning is important for teachers. I got this quote from this book. I love that wee book that Tom Sherrington wrote about Rosenshine's principles. It's a great little book, but from his kind of examination of Rosenshine's principles, which if you haven't read, Google them, they're really kind of good little gives a great little background to excellent teaching. He did a bit of research into what excellent teachers did and how that tied in with a lot of educational research and cognitive science research, and kind of put it all together in a paper. But it was found that more effective teachers ask more questions in the classroom, and significantly that they asked a lot of process questions. You know, they wouldn't just ask a question and then move on. They'd ask a question and follow up with, can you explain to me how you got that answer? You know, and getting pupils to explain their thinking and really getting pupils to elaborate. So that was, you know, just to kind of set the scene about why questioning is important. And then this next quote, I show this to my student teachers a lot when I talk to them about questioning. And I think the reason I show this quote a lot is because I think it sums up a state that I was in, I think, once I'd been teaching for a few years. I'm going to just let you read that. I'm just going to stay quiet. Right, so I took that from the Working Inside the Black Box book for the work of Black and William. You know, there was the Inside the Black Box, was a wee black one. This came for the silver one. I think you can, if you Google it, I think you can find a dodgy copy free online. But I took that from that, and I think why it resonated with me is I think that's how my questioning became once I'd been teaching for a few years. I kind of started reflecting on my own practice, and I won't talk much more about that because we'll talk more about reflection later. But I started to realise that my questioning's rubbish here, actually. I'm just going to the 3 or 4 pupils in the class that I know are going to give me that right answer so that I can move on with my lesson. And it really made me stop and think about my questioning. Okay, so why do we use questioning in the classroom, right? And I've taken this from, I love this book. This was a book that I read when I was a teacher, and I absolutely love it. I don't know if you can read that there. It's called Making Every Science Lesson Count. And this was a book I loved. I loved it because it's so easy to read. I read very little books about teaching when I was working as a teacher. I was a teacher and a head of science for about 15 years. And I found when I got home at night, I was just too tired to actually pick up a book and read about more education. But that is a book that I was like, wow, it was really easy to read and really engaging. And it really made me realise that we can talk about how we teach, because I found that in Scotland we've been talking far too much about the curriculum, about moderating, about coming together and making sure we've got an agreement of pupils have achieved a level instead of actually focusing on what we do in the classroom. So I really loved that book. But they talk about how we can use a question, right, and why we use a question, right? And we use questions to say test an understanding of a new concept, or to kind of, so that might be, you know, it could be just a closed question to find out if people can recall something, or a more open question to really delve into their thinking, or we might want to kind of get pupils to elaborate on their thinking to really see if we can push their understanding. Oh, sorry, let me answer. To really to push their understanding of a concept. Also, we find sometimes, and you probably find yourself when you're in the classroom, sometimes we feel that we're working the hardest in the classroom when we're actually teaching pupils. And when we're using questions, it's ensuring that everyone is kind of taking a load of the cognitive work, that the pupils are working as hard as we are, if not harder than we are in the classroom. And it gives that kind of academic culture in the classroom. You know, the pupils are expecting to be on their toes, that they know they're going to be asked to contribute to the lesson at any time. It's also been shown that when we're answering questions, we're retrieving things from our long-term memories. It's not just a testing method, it's actually a learning thing, that whenever pupils are recalling that information, it's helping them to learn it and strengthening those connections in their memory so that they can recall it even easier the next time. And it also just creates curiosity in our pupils. When we are asking questions, it's more likely then to get our pupils to start thinking more about what we're teaching them and getting them more to ask questions. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, and Douglas will talk a little bit about what we're going to see here.
Not so much talk about a little about what you're going to see. It shows a teacher that no longer works in the classroom. Perhaps once you see the video, you'll understand why. We're interested in the practice of the particular teacher, and what I want you to imagine is that you've been asked by the teacher to sit at the back of the classroom to comment on a lesson. The teacher's very keen for the opportunities to improve his practice, and the question that we would like you to address, put in chat as much as you would like. What feedback would you give to this teacher? Please feel free to use chat as much as you would like. Okay, we'll watch the video. Okay, we'd like to give you a few minutes just to comment on chat. Yeah.
Yeah, so any thoughts of advice that you could give that teacher to improve their practice at questioning there? Don't be shy.
Maybe ask Paul.
There we go.
To this teacher, just out of interest. Can you get Paul? Is Paul muted?
Oh, sorry. I
yeah.
was reading the comments. What did you say there, Douglas?
No, it's okay.
You got it?
Yeah, what advice would you give, Paul?
I think that I'm seeing some good comments coming in there. So yeah, the bit that you're asking closed questions and you're getting angry that the kids are actually answering, I think that's a fairly big piece of advice I would give, is that A, closed questions will encourage the kids to shout out, and B, it seems unfair to give the kids a bad time if they're actually giving you answers, because I don't know from anybody else, but I'm just happy that a kid's kind of taking part in the lesson. You know, if they're doing that, that means they're actually taking part, and that's a good thing. Yeah, it gets people into trouble. Using command, yeah, I thought that was interesting. Somebody saying using command words and verbs rather than asking questions. So actually taking a leaf out the SQA's book. That's a really interesting one. C. Doherty, who's made that comment. I've actually changed a lot of my questions. So I do a lot of starter activities with a question, like when kids are coming in, and I've recently started to rewrite a lot of them with command words, because that's what the SQA do, and try and get them to more used to those kind of things. So instead of saying, what is this, you know, what is the molarity, the concentration of this solution here? If that's the starter question I'm using, which would be unusual because that's a closed question, but that's by the by, I might say calculate the, and, you know, actually use the SQA command word. So that's an interesting one that you've come up with there. Wendy's saying more open questions. Yeah, again, more open questions that are not going to be a shout out question, something that's got a longer answer. And also, to me, questions that allow the kids to answer at the level that they're at. You know, if the PHB in 7 or whatever it is either something you know, you don't. If you know it, you know it. You don't, you don't. And that's sort of very binary state of affairs. If you can ask a question in such a way that the kids can kind of answer the question in whatever way they like or whatever level they're at, that's more powerful as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, Kat. Oh, thanks, Paul. You've started, so you'll finish, I can tell.
Sorry, that was probably a longer answer than you wanted.
no, that's fine. What's interesting, that video has been used in a number of occasions, and it's amazing the number of people that have come up to me at the end of the afternoon and said, oh, I really found it very funny, but during the afternoon I was thinking about it, and in fact it could have been me last Friday afternoon. So I think it's certainly this business about closed questions and the impact of closed questions is something that's worthwhile considering at all times. If we move on to the next slide.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. This is what's come up in chat, among other things. Certainly try to use more open questions. So let's think for a minute again, and it's a task for chat if you can manage. What do open questions do that closed questions don't do? Something to think about for a couple of minutes. All comments in chat welcome.
Good, explore understanding. I like that. I like that. Develop a discussion. Yeah. Good. Thanks, Fran.
Wendy, do you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, this is something I've been chatting to my probationers and student teachers about currently, and really trying to encourage them to use open questions. Kind of coming back to what Paul's saying from like a differentiation point of view, that if you ask an open question, there are more people in the room who will be able to participate in some way, even if they don't have maybe the full answer that you're looking for yet, they can start an answer and other people can build on it. So you can bring other people's in and they can learn from each other and learn from each other answering questions in their own language and trying out the language themselves. So for example, if you were looking at soluble metal oxides, as I was watching a lesson today, where one was soluble and it went purple. So asking like, what does this mean? Why is this went purple? You know, pupils who have a very basic understanding of pH scale can say, well, that's went purple because it's an alkali. But those that have more understanding can build on that and say, well, that's an alkali because that's a soluble metal oxide. So when they dissolve, they form alkalis. And, you know, other people can build on that when we looked at the insoluble metal oxides as well. So asking the more open questions just can get more pupils involved, so that they don't feel like they have to have like the perfect answer to answer your question.
Right, thanks a lot. Right, thanks a lot. Lots of good comments on chat. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, here are some things that folk have said in the past and perhaps being repeated today to promote discussion. With many, everyone can try to answer, make students think and do more than make demands on memory. With a closed question, for example, you know, what's the pH of water? You can't really answer the question unless you know the answer. So it's really just testing what you already understand, what you already know, and it doesn't move you on as a result. Whereas if we go on to the next slide, I think the benefit of open questions is summed up. Open questions are good for learning. Through asking open questions, the answers can actually move the learning of the students on. And of course, as we saw in that video, they're also pretty good for classroom management. What's the gas produced during photosynthesis? And they might, as soon as they hear the word gas, they may be able to shout out an answer. But however, if you ask them what's meant by photosynthesis, certainly there's not the same degree of shouting out. So open questions, good for learning, but they're also good for classroom management. Okay, moving on. Some examples of ways to frame a good question for learning. A good number of you will have seen this slide before. And it's helpful to have them really just in your armory and ready to use whenever you feel appropriate. They tell us what you know about, tell us more about, what do you think about, what do you see. A feature of these questions is that anyone can answer them. What do you see in particular? There's no such answer as I don't know. It's what do you see? And it's the advantage of these questions is that anyone can answer. What do you think would happen if? I always tell the story of being in a Glasgow classroom and the teacher was holding a coin above a beaker of acid. And it was quite a lively class. And the teacher asked the class, what do you think is going to happen when I drop the coin into the beaker of acid? And there was a wee boy that was very keen to answer. I was surprised that she took the wee boy's answer because he was really beginning to almost shout out. But eventually he said, right, okay, what do you think is going to happen if we drop the pound coin into the acid? And the wee boy, quick as a flash, says, nothing. And the teacher was a bit surprised. And good follow-up, why do you think that? So she asked the wee boy, why do you think nothing will happen? And the wee boy, quick as a flash, said, if something was going to happen, you'd have used a penny, miss, not a pound. And it shows that's an indication of how you have to be prepared for unexpected answers if you use the what do you think would happen if. Yeah, so it's a bank of ways to frame good questions for learning that we can keep in mind. Okay, next slide. Yeah, how best to deal with incorrect answers. Maybe with time moving on, we should just keep this moving. Standard practice, why do you say that? And of course, if depending on the answer, it is quite useful to ask other students, do you agree? And then you can begin to get discussion. And of course, if the answer is not correct, then we try to resist the temptation of, clearly you're very thick and you should have been paying more attention. Instead, it's much better to go back to I've not explained this very well. Perhaps I should try and reframe this in another way. Okay, thanks. Moving on. Some students don't answer in class. Well, we can read this, I suppose. How can practice be changed? And we're going to look at different ways of trying to encourage participation. If we go on to the next slide, it's important that all answers are valued. I've been in classrooms and the teacher's been asking, for example, of, can you name foods that contain carbohydrates? If the student answers potatoes, the answer is written on the board. If the student answers something that doesn't contain carbohydrates, then the student's not written in the board. So it's only the answers that are correct that are valued. And an alternative approach is to write all the correct answers at one side of the board, but the incorrect answers at the other side, and then at the end ask, well, what's the difference between the two columns? It's important that all answers are valued, even the incorrect ones. And of course, as we all know, half-right answers are particularly interesting because half-right answers can be very good for learning. Half-right answers can be a pathway on the way to a right answer. So half-right answers are very good in terms of learning and must be, and it's good to have them valued. Okay, looking at others, we're going to begin with 3 from Wendy, I think.
We were, but Wendy's just disappeared. She sent me an email during this to say that she's totally frozen, so I think she's going to leave and come back in again. Will I move on and talk about what I was going to talk about, and then we can come back if Wendy comes back in. I was going to talk a wee bit about thinking time and the thinking time that we give pupils. I know this again was something that I was probably very guilty of as a teacher, was just not given enough thinking time and not having a real understanding of how much thinking time that we should be given to our pupils. So it's crucial that we give them thinking time. Pupils need to kind of think and formulate an answer in their head before they can be comfortable to actually volunteer that answer to the class. Okay, so and by giving thinking time as well, we're promoting these higher expectations. We're showing our pupils that we don't want just the first thing that comes into our head. If pupils get used to the fact that we're going to give them a lot of thinking time, it's raising that expectation. They know that they're expected to formulate the best answer that they can possibly come up with. Okay? And the research has shown that the longer wait you give, the higher quality response that you actually get. Okay, so a lot of classroom research has shown this, that you'll get more responses from more pupils, and the responses will be of a higher quality as well. So the suggestion is closed questions, we should be given about 3 seconds of thinking time at least for a closed question. These are kind of minimum. And 3 seconds might not sound like a lot, but when you're in a classroom, I think the research I read showed that a lot of teachers for closed questions, it was less than 1 second they were given as thinking time before moving on to another pupil or just answering the question themselves. So it's really 3 questions. I'm going to kind of defend, I know we're talking a lot about open questions. There is a time and a place for closed questions, so don't think for a second that there isn't. If you're teaching National 5 chemistry and you want to find out if pupils know the general formula of the alkane family, then feel free to ask them, what is the general formula for the alkane family? There's a time and a place for closed questions, but then you can follow up with an open question. What makes you think that, or how did you come to that answer? So you can really probe their understanding. And for open questions, they're suggesting 10 to up to 30 seconds you should be given of thinking time, so that students can really formulate a good answer. And what should we be doing in that time? Right, so I know when I was a teacher, I hated silence. I felt we need to blather all the time, and I just felt we need to fill silence. I had to kind of think of strategies that I would use to actually allow that thinking time and allow pupils the time to think. So, you know, we can use that thinking time to really kind of develop their kind of metacognitive skills and their thinking skills. You know, you can be saying things like, you know, I can see people checking their notes, that's brilliant, you know, and that encourages other people to realise that I can look at my notes and do that, right? Or, you know, same things like, you know, your first answer might not be the best answer, so have a real think about what you think is the right answer to this question, right? I can see people thinking deeply, so I'm going to give you a few more seconds just to think about this, you know, or tell people, you know, say, look, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to formulate your answer here, so you've got time to really think, right, so that you're given that expectation to the pupils, right? So that's a way of saying it, right? Or just silence, you know, just waiting there and giving them that silence to formulate an answer and not interrupt them, okay? And sometimes it's good to give a wait time after a question has been asked. You know, you might get that half right answer, or maybe a question that's just not fully done, and you can just be like, and, you know, just to show that expectation that you're looking for a bit more from the pupils. Okay. So, strategies that we can use in the classroom. This baby gate's great. Douglas can't even get out. Look. Right. So, you know, a strategy that I always used was no hands up. You know, I would always kind of, it allowed me to actually direct questions at individual pupils. So cold calling comes from the kind of technique I think was first mentioned in Doug Lemov's book. He talks about cold calling, Teach Like a Champion, as a great book. With lots of different strategies, and he talks about cold calling, about directing your questions at specific pupils without asking for, without looking for hands up, you know, or you can tell the pupils, you know, you can put your hand up, but I might not come to you. If you put your hand up, I might come to absolutely anyone in the classroom. Okay, so you can have a think about what you might think of the advantages and disadvantages of that strategy. While I'm still talking here, feel free just to add to the chat at any point. Wendy's back with us. So I'm going to go back to Wendy at some point just to go back to her slides. Okay. So cold calling, I used a lot, but it has got its advantages and disadvantages. You know, one of the advantages I found was that, you know, I wasn't getting the same people answering my questions all the time. Disadvantages are where pupils might be really anxious and not comfortable at sharing their thinking in front of the whole class. You know, things I did to get around that is if I'm circulating the class when the class are working on something, I might say to a pupil who I know might lack confidence or whatever, I might point out to them, that's a great answer. That is absolutely spot on. When I'm going over this, I'm going to come to you, and that is a brilliant answer, but I'm going to come to you, you're going to share that with the class. So the pupil knows that they've got the answer right, and that reduces that kind of stress a little bit, right? Some teachers I know use lollipop sticks. They'll have the lollipop sticks with all the names on, and that allows them to draw randomly, right? That's got its advantages and disadvantages as well. You know, it gets that randomness. You're not having that bias and getting attracted to asking the same pupils all the time. The major disadvantage I have is that I remember once teaching years ago, and a pupil so proud walking into my class, showing me the lollipop stick from his other teacher's class that he'd managed to pilfer, so that he knew he was never going to get asked a question in that class ever again, because he had managed to remove his lollipop stick from the teacher's wee jar of lollipop sticks. So there's your disadvantage. Other disadvantage could be that you might want to use your questioning as a bit of a kind of differentiation strategy. So if you're just asking randomly, you can't direct questions at specific pupils. You know, you might have certain questions that you know, I really want to stretch that pupil, or exactly there, Wendy's just saying it there, you don't pitch the question correctly for each pupil. You know, there might be certain pupils you think I really want to stretch them here, or other pupils you think I really want to kind of build their confidence to try and increase their motivation. So I'm going to give them a question that I'm quite confident they'll be able to answer. So you can direct the questions at specific people. Right, I'm going to rewind to Think, Pair, Share now that Wendy is with us. Let me just quickly go back. Can I do that? And it just goes back. Has that went back? Yeah, has that worked? Yeah.
Yeah, apologies.
Is that on your slide, Wendy? Yeah.
Everything just froze. Yeah, this was one of mine. I think it was anyway. I'll go backwards. I printed it out earlier. Yeah, so Think, Pair, Share is something that I quite like to do with pupils for starter questions as well, because I get them to think in silence on their own. So give them a certain amount of time to think on their own. They can write things down if they want to. Sometimes I'll do Think, Write, Pair, Share, and I especially do that with seniors as well. I can still do it with like advanced higher, and get them to maybe write a definition of something on their own, and then give them a certain amount of time to discuss it with their partner before then taken a few answers from around the class. And I feel like if they've got the writing element as well, you can go round and you can actually check they are doing something, and you're not interrupting their thinking as much because you're not having to speak to them, because they're doing it in silence. And if they're jotting stuff down, you can just peer over their shoulder and have a look at what they're writing, and then give them that time to discuss with a partner where they can rehearse their answer, and then get those answers from a few different groups and see if you can build on it from there. And if they've written it down, they can compare each other's answers and sometimes join them together to make an even better answer as one together. So yeah, advantages: it promotes classroom talk about the subject, it gets people rehearsing their answers, and also gives them all a chance to answer the question. So everybody is answering the question, but it might only be one person who actually answers the question to the whole class. And the shared responsibility means that they kind of have that little bit of confidence as well, that if it's not quite right, it was both of them together. So they can kind of, they can take it a bit together, that, oh, we didn't get it, but it was us together. It wasn't just one person that was doing it. I can't talk and read at the same time. People are typing in the chat. I'm just not capable of that. So yeah, Paul's got here, I generally remember that no answer is the only acceptable answer. Yeah, I have similar in my classroom as well. Good, yeah, that's all on Think, Pair, Share there. I think you added that slide in there, Colin.
I did, yeah, I did that slide because I'd seen this presentation, saw Wendy was going to talk about Think, Pair, Share, and I love Think, Pair, Share as well. I think it was really good for all the reasons that Wendy said. And this just happened to pop up in my Twitter feed at the time, that someone had just found research on the effects of Think and Pair before Share. So it was all about Think, Pair, Share, and I've highlighted kind of important points there. That analysis revealed that Think, Pair, Share led to more hand raising. They had more pupils that were willing to volunteer answers after a Think, Pair, Share. And then, kind of importantly, I think that Wendy was talking about as well, is that shy students that said that they had concerns about raising their hand, right? They benefited from Think, Pair, Share. They were more likely to volunteer an answer because they had that discussion, and it wasn't just their answer, it was their peers' answer. So it's been found to be really, really beneficial, Think, Pair, Share. Okay. Right, so I'll move back on to other, I was going to talk about different strategies that I've used. Conscripts and volunteers was one that I ended up using once I had tried using cold calling, and I kind of reflected on it, and I knew that it wasn't working with all my classes. And it's basically just a mixture. It's a mixture of cold call. And I would tell my pupils, put your hand up, but I might not come to you. But then if it was a pupil that didn't answer questions that often, or didn't answer them well that often, and I could see that they had their hand up dying to answer, and I was quite confident this kid knows the right answer, and it's really going to be good for them if I go to them rather than just ignore their hand and cold calling someone else, that I would just take the hand up. I would just take the kid with a hand up and get them to answer. So I'd use that mixture. So I'd say to the pupils, like, put your hand up if you know the answer. I might come to you if your hand's up, but I might also go to someone who's not put their hand up, and I'll just use that mixture so that it would keep that engagement going, because sometimes you get really keen pupils just thinking, I never get asked, what's the point? I never get asked. So if you see a pupil that's really, really keen to answer, then it gives you that opportunity to go to them. Okay, and you can use these techniques. It's keeping that motivation going, and you can use these techniques to use something called pose, pause, pounce, bounce. All right, so basically you're asking a question, and that could be via cold calling or to someone who's got their hand up, and then you're using the pause. That's your thinking time, giving the pupils time to think about and formulate their answer. Right? And then you're pouncing, you're asking several pupils for the response, so you can just choose that at random, but you might choose people that have got their hands up, and you don't need to tell them whether it's a right or wrong answer. You can just say, right, what's your answer? Okay, what can you give me? What your thoughts are? And then you're bouncing those ideas then around the class. What do you think? Do you agree with that then? Well, for 3 different answers here, who do you think's got the right answer? And just bouncing that around, involving as many pupils as you can in that kind of questioning session, and getting a lot of engagement into that, and really kind of getting pupils to elaborate on their thinking. So I really enjoyed doing that. And the final one I'm going to talk about just now is just kind of delayed response questions. And I used to use these for practicals, or I'd sometimes just use them at the end of a lesson. That if a pupil's about to do a practical, I'd put a couple of questions on the board and say, these are the questions that I'm going to ask 2 people these questions. after the practical. So this is what, and it gave the pupils something to focus on while they were carrying out a practical, because they knew, right, this is what I need to look for, right? Is it might just be kind of, what is the colour change, and what do you think might cause this colour change or something? You know, it'd just be 2 questions related to the practical that meant pupils would actually focus on the learning that I wanted them to get from the practical. And I'd also do it at the end of the lesson as well, that at an end of a lesson, I might say something like, right, when you are in here tomorrow morning, in the starter questions, these are what the starter questions are going to be, you know, and it's basically kind of reinforcing what I want the main learning from my lesson to be, because they knew that someone was going to get asked these questions first. You know, it could be, right, period 1, you're back in here tomorrow morning, these are the questions I'm going to be asking, right? So I expect you to know the answers, and just having that delayed response, sharing questions with the pupils just to get them thinking about an answer so that they've got time to prepare, and it helps them to really kind of reinforce the pupils of what do I want the learning to be, because I've given them these important questions that I want them thinking about. All right. Now, and I think the next slide goes on to what there was a wee bit of the chat about, is about the kind of accepting I don't know. So, Douglas.
Yeah, perhaps this is one really for students. I know that they often find it very difficult because they're given what seems to be conflicting advice. On the one hand, when it comes to questioning, a teacher will say, just don't accept, I don't know. Or as Paul would say in Fife, I dinna ken. It's just not acceptable. And yet, on other occasions, the teacher will say, if a student doesn't answer, to say it's okay to pass. You know, how can it be that, you know, 2 quite conflicting pieces of advice are in fact both acceptable? You know, can we give examples when one is acceptable and other examples are another example when the other is exempt? Is it to do with different contexts? How can we help students to cope with what seems to be conflicting advice? Paul, you must remember again days when you were often given conflicting advice of this kind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much the first one on these. I kind of ask all the questions that I'm asking, that I'm using, because I use a random selector, Class Dojo, as I was saying in the chat. And I write all the questions so that there is no way that anyone can pass. And as I say, if I've written a question in a way that I genuinely get a kid who can't answer, then what I'll do is I'll repitch the question at them. And so maybe it's a calculation I've put on the board. It's okay. Go looking for something that looks like a volume. It will have CM3 after it, or someone like that. I'll repitch the question at them so that I know I'm giving them something they can answer. So actually, I don't subscribe to the second one at all here. It would be very unusual, if almost unheard of, for me to go for it's okay to pass.
Would you agree with that, Wendy, or would you ever say it's okay to pass?
I kind of combine the two. If they tell me they don't know, I'll take it at face value. Maybe they don't know, and I'll say to them, that's okay, but I'll come back to you. And they'll either get another question later on where I'm like, okay, if they genuinely didn't know, I'll maybe ask them a question that I know they can answer, so that they are answering something. Or once somebody else has answered the question, I'll go back to that person and I'll say, what's the answer? And then that means they have to keep listening to everyone in the room. So if they did know originally and they were just deciding they weren't going to answer, then they feel like I should probably just take a guess the next time. And if they genuinely didn't know, then they're having that chance to rehearse the answer themselves, having heard someone else say the answer. So I suppose I kind of join the two together. But it's not it's okay to pass and I'm never coming back.
I'm totally on board with the Wendy Adams technique. That's how I did it. You know, I would take I don't know and say, okay, that's fair enough. You don't know, go to someone else who could then answer the question, and then go back and say, okay, now can you answer the question? And it means it means, as Wendy says, they have to focus and listen and get the answer to the question, so they get a bit of learning out of it. And I found it just avoided laziness as well, that kids just thinking, oh, I don't really need to listen, I'll just say I don't know, and he'll just move on to someone else, kind of thing. So I would always go, so they knew that if they genuinely didn't know, that they would still have to verbalise that answer back to me.
Right, thanks, Colin. Wendy, I think you're going to say a few words about the next slide.
Yes, so these are, I don't know if that's me. So these are 3 techniques that I've looked at for exploring deeper understanding through questioning. So not just like one question and then stopping. But the first one, it was one that was introduced to me by an NQT a couple of years ago. Agree, build and challenge. So when you get an answer from a pupil, going to the next one and saying, do you agree with them? Do you build on it? Or are you going to challenge it? And even if they agree with it, they have to explain why they agree. So they have to pick out what is correct about that person's answer. If they're building on it, they have to say like what is correct and what would they add on. And if they're challenging it, they have to say why they don't think it's correct and what they think the correct answer would be. And then you can keep it going around the room. You can do it for maybe smaller questions, but it is quite good for maybe like more discussion things, looking at things like the carbon cycle, like climate change, those sorts of more discussion elements. It means you can get more of a debate going on in the room. And the NQT that kind of introduced this to me was a geography NQT. So they have a lot more debates and things going on in their classroom. And I thought it'd be quite nice to bring that into a science classroom as well. And then the always asking why and asking for an explanation. I realised, I think it was last week, that my higher class must think I'm like a broken record, that any time I ask them a question, I'll be like, and why do you think that? Right? To the point that they now, before I even ask them, they will just explain. So when I was going through calculations, like, well, you need to calculate the moles because you need to do this mess and you take that and you take those together and you do this and that, and they just do it now. They just explain now. So they all know that I'm going to ask, why is that? Why have you came up with that answer? Could you explain it further? And then just kind of going back to the video at the start, red, green, avoiding questions that will cause random guessing. So rather than asking questions which will cause random guessing, sort of almost stating the obvious of what they're seeing and then asking for explanations of why that has happened, to get the deeper learning rather than just the, oh, it'll go red, oh, it'll go green, oh, it's pH 7 or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, just a few techniques to try and get deeper understanding out of the pupils and using it in a way to kind of find out what they actually know. Yeah.
Beyond random guessing, I mean, they can play, the guessing could be guess what's in the teacher's mind. As soon as they say what colour, they can think of a colour, and what number, they can think of a number, how many, they can think of a number. So it's not so much guessing the right answer as guessing the question that the teacher's going to ask. And we get back to the point that was made earlier, questions which lead to random guessing are not terribly good when it comes to classroom management. Okay, moving on, we're going to finish off by thinking a wee bit about reflective practice. We're really going to just introduce this topic this afternoon. We're hoping to have a full session on reflective practice sometime next year or indeed even beyond. The question that we would like everyone to consider, not to really put anything on chat, but just to have a think about it. To what extent does reflective practice influence your teaching? If I go back to the time when I was in the classroom, if I'm honest, it's sometimes the reflective practice was little more than, oh, I think that was a pretty good lesson, or that really wasn't very good, I must try and do something different next time. If I knew then what I know now about the impact of reflective practice, I'm sure I would have gone about it in a quite different way. The problem for me, really answering that question for teachers is, as most of you know, I haven't taught in a classroom for about 40 years. And you might say I don't appreciate the demands of the classroom, because what I do believe is that effective reflective practice requires a sort of semi-structured approach of some kind, not necessarily writing things down, but there has to be some kind of structure to the way you're going about it. And often it will be writing something down. This, of course, requires time, and time is the one thing that teachers do not have. So I'm interested in Paul and Wendy and Colin's thought. How can we perhaps find some time in order to advance reflective practice if we feel that that is really a cornerstone of effective teaching? The short answer, Paul, but give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Douglas. Yeah, so I mean, to me, it's a really, really important thing, but I completely agree that the time factor is so difficult for teachers. I have found my morning swim is where my reflective practice happens. I swim every morning in Kirkcaldy Pool just down the road, and I hate swimming, but I know it's good for me. Like at the age of 41, it's like something I should be doing, and I utterly detest it, and I find it really boring. But it's so good because it allows my mind to actually consider what's going on in my lessons, the things that are bothering me, the things that I want to fix. And I had a couple of really nice examples just the last couple of weeks. So as I said, do these starter questions, and it's always got the aim on the board as well. And because the aim's a question, sometimes the kids will come in and try and answer the aim and not the starter question. And I was thinking, right, what can I do about this? And this has been a problem for ages. And so just in the last 2 weeks, I've started colouring the starter questions purple. So it differentiates between the two. And the kids are now spotting that these things are not the same. They're actually different, and it's working a treat. And the other problem I was having is that particularly in certificate level, I have real trouble referring to the notes. Like we give the kids notes and then I sort of just hand them out and forget about them. And so again, what I've been doing is thought, what can I do about this? Because the kids are not getting that familiarity with the notes. It's a real problem. And so I've actually started putting into the starters questions directly about the notes. So use page 7 of the notes to find this information. But it was my morning swims that did that. It was that reflection that I do every single morning that when I'm toying this over in my head going, okay, I really want to fix this issue. I'm not happy about this. So that's my reflective practice right there.
Right. Thanks, Paul. Okay, Wendy, I mean, the importance of reflective practice and the time factor.
Yeah, so for me, I quite like doing my reflections in conversation with other people. And I have the advantage, obviously, being principal teacher, that I can kind of decide what goes in meetings. So we do a lot of reflection together as a department and as a faculty. So every meeting always has learning and teaching within it, and we talk about the things that we've tried and what has went well and what hasn't. So I find time within the week to think about that before those meetings, because I know someone else is going to want to talk about it. So having that incentive of we're going to be chatting about this with someone else means that I will consider the things that we're currently thinking about within our faculty. So for us at the moment, it's learning intentions and success criteria. So it has meant that I'm looking more deeply at my learning intentions and success criteria and how I use them within lessons and how they're worded. And because I know on Thursday I'm going to be chatting to up to 12 other people about that, then I will think about it in advance and make the effort to sit and do it. I think I also put on a slide, I don't know if it's going to be the next one or not, and I can see it behind Colin. This book here, Walkthroughs, is one of my favourite teaching books at the moment. I recommend it to anyone. So the Walkthroughs book has, and there's walkthroughs too, and there's walkthroughs 3 coming. I saw on Twitter the other day. It's like a double page spread, and it's 5 steps for a technique within the classroom. But as part of it, they're very generic in terms of you can adapt them for any subject, and primary or secondary. But they have this adapt process which they work through, which is attempt, develop, adapt, practice, and test. And I really like the attempt part of this, because they say you can even do it in your head. So doing like a mental walkthrough of a lesson and working out where the pitfalls will be within that lesson and fixing them before they happen, because you know your class, so you know where things might go wrong. And then you might want to switch around the 5 steps to be in a different order. So that's the developing part. And the adapting bit, trying it out in your classroom, practicing it, and then taking notes, even mentally, about which bit of those 5 parts didn't work or did work. And then eventually the testing is having a look at some pupil data, perhaps looking at, could be formative assessment, could be summative assessment, could be just work they've done in class. So I quite like that structure, because as Douglas says, having some sort of structure can help you reflect. And that structure just kind of takes you through quite easily from wanting to try something to working out if it worked or not.
Right, thanks.
I was going to say, I'm not in any commission or anything like that, but those teaching walkthrough books are like £3 for the Kindle version. The Kindle version is £3, and the Kindle version is absolutely brilliant, because I don't know, you'll not even see them. The phone, if you get the Kindle app for your phone, it's just brilliant, because it just goes through each step. It's just one a page on each step. You can just get through. So it's something you can even look at just at lunchtime or something like that. If you're thinking what you try something, it just goes through the 5 steps for like various different teaching strategies. I love the books as well. But yeah, the Kindle versions are like £3 or something like that. So it's really kind of cheap to get. Yeah, I totally agree with when you're saying about reflection. I think I did a lot of mine just driving home. I found I didn't have a lot of time to write down. I'd love to write down reflections. I did it for a while, but I just I didn't have the time, so I would just do it while I was driving home. I'd think about, right, how did my teaching go today? Often when I was principal teacher of science, it was usually terrible. I always found I became the worst teacher in the department when I became principal teacher of science. But I'd be thinking, reflecting on what went well, what do I need to improve on, how am I going to improve? And that's what we really want kind of to push from this. It's great coming to a questioning session, but where you'll really kind of do your learning is when you try out some of these things and reflect on how well they went. And you'll find some of them will work with some classes, not work with other classes. And that's where you do your real kind of learning, is when you try out these strategies that we're talking about today and reflecting on how well they work and adapting them, because you might think, well, no, I've tweaked it a little bit and this works for me now and this is how I'm going to do it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of time. There's not a lot of time, but I have a lot of time for reflection, but I don't have a lot of time for reflection, which is probably what I'm trying to say, I think.
I think that's a very good way, a very good way of putting it. For anyone interested in reflecting on their questioning technique, if we just go through the slides at the end now, we're nearly there. The first slide, if you're interested in making questioning a focus of your reflective practice, perhaps set targets. Targets is rather a harsh word because, as has been said already, some of this will really be in your mind. But whatever you're thinking of doing, it has to be relatively clear, concise and specific. I don't think you're going to get anywhere if you simply say, well, I'm going to think about improving my questioning technique. You really have to be prepared to home in on a specific aspect of what makes a good questioning technique. And to help, there is a handout that will be available online for those that are interested. And the handout is really a commentary on different aspects of what makes a good questioning technique. The commentary is listed under topics. Neither the topics nor everything in the commentary is an exhaustive list of any kind. They're simply a distillation of good ideas that a number of folk have picked up. I'm not sure if there's complete agreement with all the ideas, but I think the majority, most folk would agree, are worthwhile considering. These are the topics under which the commentary is organised. The next slide, I think, shows an example of one commentary. And what follows is a number of slides which show what various folk have written. Those who are interested in keeping a written record. We'll maybe look at the first couple, and then if you want a copy of the slides, you'll be able to see the rest. And the likes of this one, I think we've touched on during this particular meeting. One more then. These are examples of what folk have tried to do as a result of thinking about their questioning technique. Okay, the last, yes, we're getting to the end now. A good lesson should always end by revisiting the learning outcomes. And I hope that we can all feel that we've gained something of value relating to each of these questions. And some further reading from Stephen. Stephen, do you want to say a word or two about these? if he's still there.
Yeah, I'm here. I've been listening, waiting for my question. Yeah, so these are all of the resources from the Raw Site of Chemistry. As I said, I'll share all of these resources with you afterwards with the presentation and hopefully the recording, and that will be sent through. Yeah, so they're all sort of self-explanatory. They're all questions, again, written by teachers for teachers, looking at how to use that in their own classroom.
Right, thanks
Yep,
a lot. And thanks a lot for joining us once again. Any questions or comment, please send to either Colin or myself, or preferably both, so that we can have a look at them. This, as we said at the start, is the second of a series of 3 workshops. Your feedback is very important in determining whether we go ahead post-Christmas. And you can, I think, Stephen, there is a form to fill, an evaluation, but any feedback in chat would also be exceptionally helpful. We very much appreciate if you could take a few minutes in order to do that. The next session is on Tuesday, the 7th of December, I think. And it's an opportunity for anyone to showcase an activity that they feel they would like to share. There's mention of this in the notice that went out in Strontium. I don't think we've had a great number of volunteers as yet. Stephen, is that correct?
Yeah, we've not had anyone. So, well, there's still places available. That's the still places available.
But we very much hope that by the 7th of December, we're confident that one way or another, we will have a sufficient number of interesting activities in order to showcase.
And that could just be if any of you want to try out any of these strategies you've learned about today and you just want to come back and tell us about how it's worked or hasn't worked, you know, just as this is what I tried and this is what I found. It'd be great to hear how you're putting anything into practice and the impact of it, you know, just to give you the opportunity to reflect and feed back to us on how it has worked.
Yeah, personally, I would like to thank particularly Stephen and Colin for helping with the IT. I'm through with Colin because I admit to being fairly low in the learning curve when it comes to using IT. If I went offline like Wendy, I'm pretty sure I would be gone for good. So I'm really very, very grateful for Stephen and Colin for helping us to get through this. And it's great to have Wendy and Paul prepared to give up their time and join us. And their contribution, Colin, I feel, and Stephen as well, is immensely valuable. And I am sure helps to make this afternoon's even more worthwhile.
Absolutely, and even as an ex-teacher, I still prefer listening to current teachers than I do like listening to ex-teachers. So I'm more than happy listening to Wendy and Paul telling us about the stuff that they're doing. And it'd be great if some of you could like volunteer just to say this is a little thing I do in my classroom and I'd love to share it. And it doesn't have to be spectacular. You know, I used to hate when I was in teaching and it was all about, oh, we need to share best practice and stuff. And that just put people off sharing things of this terminology of shared best practice. We just want to share interest in practice. I do this and it's quite interesting. It might work for you, it might not. You know, so just come along and show it. There's no pressure. We just want to see what you've been trying out in your classroom and how it goes.
I think it's fair to say that long term, if this pilot is successful and the demand for CPD in Scotland written by Scottish teachers for Scottish teachers, there is an intention to try and offer different forms of professional development in the future. And it's unlikely there's going to be monthly meetings post-Christmas. It's likely that the timescale will extend a little, or maybe only 2 between the New Year and March. Any feedback of any kind is most welcome. Declan, I see you're still online from Northern Ireland. Do you want to say a word or two?
No, just thank you for a very informative and interesting piece of work. And I agree that Scottish CPD for Scottish teachers is a good way forward, and the RSC will be there to support through Stephen and Laura.
Right, thanks a lot indeed. One slide at the end, have we? Stephen, Declan, do you want to say a word or two?
So this is our Chemistry Accessible for All. This is a report that we launched. Again, there's a lot of stuff that we're releasing. We've just recently launched our sustainability in the curriculum. Again, all of this will be shared afterwards, but it's just pointing you in a direction. There's lots of really good tips about how to make the sessions more inclusive, thinking about using outreach providers. It's part of a big 5-year project that's ongoing at the moment. But as I say, I'll probably discuss that. I'll send that an email so you'll have the information. If you've got any questions, feel free to get in touch. In the chat as well, I'll just highlight, so I've put in a link for our Teacher Empowerment Fund. So that is all for teacher professional development. If you all wanted to get together and talk about questioning within your own authority, within schools, that's money that you can use. So previously that's been really successful for Scottish teachers. We've had them applying, and that can pay for catering, anything to do that support your professional development. And finally, I've put into the chat our Inspiring Young Chemists funding. That's coming from the Scottish Education Division. It's been run by our members. That was just launched today. So up to £500 you can apply for multiple schools working together, or up to £200 if you're just the individual school on your own. And that can be used for both primary and secondary. So just I like to highlight when we've got money available for you to use. And please get in touch if there's any questions.
Cool. So, cheers, Stephen. I was just going to say, basically, you're free to leave and you're free to stay now, really, aren't you, Douglas? We're going to kind of hang about if anybody wants to kind of unmute themselves and kind of have a chat about how, like, maybe any more questions they've got about anything else we've said today, or they want to kind of talk about how they're using questioning in a classroom. I know some of you are maybe just sitting with your stomach rumbling and thinking, I need to go and just stuff my face, and that's absolutely fine. But if anybody wants to kind of unmute themselves and share, I'll stop sharing my, I'll stop presenting so that I can see more on the screen. And if anybody just wants to kind of chip in with anything, then please feel free to do so.
If anyone, guys, am I still on? Yeah, if anyone wants to talk about the most appropriate, or mention the most appropriate day at the moment, there's no day that's ideal, but Tuesday seems to be as good as any. Tuesday at 4 o'clock using Teams seems to be as good as any, but it's not necessarily fixed for the future. And we're very interested in your thoughts, the most appropriate time, the most appropriate day, and really anything that you feel would help those who are involved in trying to take this forward. Your ideas would be most welcome. And if you're staying online, do feel free to let us know. But let's not all go quiet.
I'll go. I can ask a question. It's interesting, just with the past week, obviously we've had COP26, and that opportunity to ask questions and encourage debate around that is probably more important than ever. Getting that, fake news, fair testing, and thinking about things like that. So I think it's a really good opportunity when discussing everyday life. I don't know what you think about that.